This is Chapter 2, Section 1, Mesopotamia. The vocabulary for this section is Tigris and Euphrates, Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, Silt, Sumer, City-state, Epic, Polytheism, Dynasty, Cultural Diffusion, Empire, and Hammurabi. Beginning in Turkey, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers run through Syria, Iraq, and to the Persian Gulf. Mesopotamia is the location that we now call Iraq. These two rivers are what fed civilization in that area, providing water, transportation, and the ability to grow crops. These rivers were so good at producing what was needed for civilization that the entire region became known as the Fertile Crescent. Fertile simply meaning good for growing. The Greek name that was later given to it was Mesopotamia, land between the rivers. Meso meaning middle, Potami meaning rivers, and the suffix of ia pretty much just mean the land. So the area between the Tigris and Euphrates is Mesopotamia, the focus of this section. All four of the civilizations that we are going to discuss in this chapter rely on the same thing. They're known as river valley civilizations because they need the rivers for their agriculture. In each case, including the Tigris and Euphrates that we are discussing now, floods would overflow the banks of the rivers. These floods would bring with them silt, a thick bed of mud full of nutrients. Now, we discussed last chapter how the nutrients can be used up by farming. Annually, once a year, this new flood would bring in new silt and new nutrients, meaning that the people did not have to continue to move to grow new crops. This isn't to say that Mesopotamia didn't have its issues. For example, the floods were unpredictable and had long periods of drought in between. To deal with this, the Mesopotamian people dug irrigation ditches. This controlled the flood water so that it wouldn't be completely everywhere, and also allowed reserves of water to help get through the drought time. There were no natural barriers, no mountains to keep enemies out, so for defense they built walls of mud brick around their cities. And there was limited natural resources, so they had to open trade with other cultures to get what they needed. When it comes quiz time, you will need to be able to name one of these challenges and the solution that corresponds with it. The main civilization within Mesopotamia was Sumer. Do not mistake it for Summer, the season that has two M's. Sumer built large cities, each surrounded by fields of barley and wheat. These cities were run as their own government, like their own nations. So we call these city-states. They were more than just cities. They had their own armies, their own taxes, everything that you would expect from a very small country. The Sumerians made scientific and cultural and technological advancements as well, such as a math system based on the number 60. Kind of like how we carry 1 every time we hit 10, they'd carry 1 every time they hit 60. Sounds like an odd system until you bear in mind telling time. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, it's still adaptations of their math system. Arches, like the one pictured here, allow for stronger support of roofs. Columns would allow for larger open rooms. Ramps versus stairs in order to get things uphill easier. Astronomy, studying of the stars. Wheeled carts. Now the wheel started as the pottery wheel, but these guys figured out the idea of putting it on the side of a cart in order to get things around easier. And cuneiform, which we mentioned in the last chapter, is their form of writing. The earliest governments in Sumer were controlled by the priests. When somebody claims to be speaking for the gods, it gives them a lot of power over the people who believe them. The people in Sumer believed that the success of their crops depended on the blessing of their gods. Since the priests were seen as the go-betweens for the gods, it made good business for the priests. If your crops were bad, you were supposed to donate a portion of your crops in order to get the gods' favor so you have better crops next year. If your crops were good, you were still supposed to donate a portion of them in order to give thanks for the gods giving you the good crops. Sumerian religion was polytheistic. Polytheism means many god belief, like the Greeks with Zeus and Hera and a whole lot of different gods and goddesses. Poly means many, theism means belief. Keep track of these word portions because they will be used again later for other things, such as monotheism, a one-god religion, or atheism, a no-god system. Some of the key figures were Enlil, their creator god. Marduk, who is pictured on the right here, was the defender of Mesopotamia. And Tiamat, who was considered a evil goddess, and his adversary, pictured on the left here. There was also a group of lesser gods called the Angalu, and basically Mesopotamians believed that each family had one of these Angalu that looked after their household. With the invention of cuneiform, the Sumerians also gave us the world's first epic. An epic is a long heroic poem that tells the story of a historical or legendary figure. The oldest known one is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the single oldest known work of fictional writing. Though it is based on some real events, it has been exaggerated to the point of fiction. This epic follows the adventures of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, and his friend Enkidu, who is a wild man that teams up with him, kind of like Tarzan. And they go about on adventures that reveal a lot about the Sumerian religion and mythology. As I mentioned, in the beginning of the Sumerian culture, the priests had control. However, military generals were given power in order to fight battles. As more and more battles broke out, more and more power was given to these military leaders until eventually they took over and became full-time rulers, claiming to be the living representatives of the gods. Now, the priests still had a lot of power, but these military rulers were kind of sharing it with them to an extent. They would pass on their control from father to son usually, and create what was called a dynasty. A dynasty is how long the power stays in one family before passing to another family. So father to son to grandson to great-grandson, and then if he dies and somebody else takes over, that's the end of that dynasty. Earlier we mentioned to make up for the lack of natural resources, Mesopotamia had to trade with other cultures. When trade is opened, ideas get exchanged between the two cultures as well. So this results in what's called cultural diffusion, where ideas from one culture get integrated, become part of another culture. This is seen quite often with a lot of different cultural aspects, especially language and religion. Or my favorite example, food. Here in the United States, you can go out for hamburgers, steak, barbecue, French restaurants, Chinese restaurants, Italian food, tacos, burritos. You take your pick. We've got a cultural diffusion brought into our culture of all these different dishes. The drawback to the city-state style of government in Sumer is that the city-states didn't get along with each other. They often declared war back and forth. Now, this was a local issue at first, but the problem is one city-state would weaken another one in battle, and a third would come in and attack both of them. And eventually it gets so weakened between so many city-states that an outside invasion takes place, comes in, and takes over everything. The guy who does this is called Sargon of Akkad. Now, the Akkadians from Akkad were from the north end of Mesopotamia, and they just worked their way right down the rivers, taking over everything in their path. When Sargon did this, he put himself in charge of all of it and created the first empire. An empire is where you create a government out of already existing governments that you bring together under one ruler. Unfortunately, the old rivalries between the city-states don't just go away because somebody new takes over. Now what happens is they continue to fight among themselves. Sargon's empire eventually falls apart under the reign of one of his descendants, and another group comes in, a group called the Amorites, nomad warriors, who decide to take over and build a capital at Babylon. Instead of making their own city, they just capture that one and decide to make it theirs. The Amorites become known as the Babylonians, and their most famous ruler was a man named Hammurabi. Before Hammurabi, a king could walk down the street and just make up laws anytime he felt like and bust people for them. Hammurabi was the first one to say, I'm going to write down the laws, everybody knows what the law is and what the punishment is if you break it. This is a picture of a pillar that was made during Hammurabi's reign. Carved on the front of it in cuneiform are a list of his laws. One of these were placed at the center of each city so no one had any excuse for not knowing what the laws were. They were the first written laws, which is better than people had before, but they were still very harsh. This is where the saying an eye for an eye comes from. Hammurabi's law literally said if you caused an accident that somebody lost their eye over, they pulled out yours. But like all civilizations in history, even the Babylonians would not last forever. Roughly 200 years after Hammurabi, the Babylonians fall to the Kassites. After that, the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, people just take take over the area constantly back and forth. To this day, it is considered a very rough, violent area of the world. There's still a lot of conflict going on that has been going off and on since 5,000 years ago. But each culture that took over would take part of the Sumerian culture into itself. That cultural diffusion, it works through trade, but it also works through war. If a conquering people, instead of saying, stop doing everything you're doing to the people they take over, say, hey, we want to learn some of your stuff, that stuff lives on in the new culture.